Now think about operating with a formation of 2 or 3 other jets that you're responsible for, you're leading, and you're going into environments, whether it's weather, whether it's combat, now you're worried about, the enemy, whether it's terrain, if you're flying down low, and you're trying to organize this mission and keep all these pieces going. Meanwhile, this airplane's throwing all this data at you. I mean, it's just not an environment that the human brain was ever designed to operate in.
Welcome to the Badass Leaders Podcast. And today we have a truly exceptional guest, Brandon Williams. Brandon is a decorated U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, former F-15E fighter pilot, and an expert in leadership and human performance. With hundreds of combat hours over Iraq and Afghanistan, he knows what it takes to lead in high-pressure, high-stakes environments. Now, as a sought-after keynote speaker, business coach, and leadership strategist, Brandon helps organizations navigate complexity, uncertainty, and change using the same principles that fighter pilots rely on. From building high-performing teams to fostering a just culture of accountability, Brandon's insights are invaluable for any business leader looking to elevate their game. Now, if you're new to the podcast, welcome to our community. We're thrilled you've taken time out of your day to learn and grow with us. Before you forget, take a moment to click that subscribe button to ensure you stay connected with the Badass Leaders community. So join me, Gill Nelms, on today's episode of the Badass Leaders Podcast, where I'm joined each week by industry experts for intimate and eye-opening discussions about the challenges and joys facing the leaders of today. Listen in and get ready to scale your company, grow your brand, and unlock your full badass potential.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
In studio as well.
Yes.
So much better than we were talking about than in virtual. So
Absolutely. Well, welcome to AGN Studios.
Thank you.
We have Brandon Williams here for the Badass Leaders Podcast. And as usual, I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell us why you're with us today.
Yes. Well, again, Angela, thank you so much for having us or having me here. Brandon Williams, the fighter pilot speaker, so leadership speaker, as you know. And my mission or my goal with my speaking through keynotes, workshops, and leadership coaching is developing leaders of high-performing and high-reliability organizations. So building high-performing leaders. And that's through all aspects of leadership, from helping people drive their focus, their clear intent for their teams, as I call it, decision-making, situational awareness, driving accountability through mutual support. And then probably the most important thing is how we improve or how our teams improve through the debrief, the fighter pilot debrief. So obviously my everything I do is number one, based on my time as a fighter pilot, how we operated, led, executed in very dynamic, uncertain, and complex environments, because that's the type of environments that most all leaders operate in some form today. But also it's based on the science behind why that works. So I'm also a professor in human factors, which human factors is really the study of why we as humans make certain decisions we do, how those environments affect us, and why we make decisions, and what affects us, and what drives what we call human error. So being a professor in that for almost 14 years now, and then my time as a fighter pilot and in aviation and everything else, combining those two, how we build our leaders to lead high-performing teams, but also, like I said, it's the science behind it. So how leaders, because I always say that, and it's called human factors leadership because leaders have to understand the human factors of leadership. And that's how we really drive better performance within our teams. Because I always say this, but no professional shows up to work saying, I'm going to make a mistake or I'm going to have a bad day today, right? There's always some human factor there, whether it's fatigue, mental, physical, complacency, lack of communication, something that's distracting us from making the right decision there. So that's what I do. That's how I talk to, again, keynotes and workshops primarily, and also leadership coaching is what I do.
So you've had a boring life most of your life is basically what I'm hearing.
I mean, it's all relative, right? Yeah. I think I could have done a lot more things too as well. Yes.
Fighter pilot. Well, that's really boring. Okay, first off, let's roll back a little bit.
Sure.
Tell us who you are as a human being outside of fighter pilot, active pilot, instructor, all of that. Who are you, when you were, I don't know, on a Saturday morning relaxing? Who are you in those instances?
So just going way back, first of all, I'm actually from the Atlanta, Georgia area.
Oh, so you're an actual native Atlantan.
I am. So grew up here. Obviously went through to high school.
Are you a North Side baby or a Grady baby?
No, I'm from the South Side. So I grew up in Fett County, Fayetteville, Georgia.
Yeah, okay.
So that's where I grew up. Graduated high school. I won't say the year. I'm just kidding.
Probably close to where I graduated, so I think we're good.
Graduated high school, went on to the United States Air Force Academy, is where I went to college. Obviously served in the Air Force. I was active duty for about 12 years. Got married also in there. In the early days of the Air Force, we had our first child, my daughter, when I was still in the Air Force, and then we got out, had my son soon after we got out. After that, as we were talking about earlier, became a major airline pilot as well, moved back to the Atlanta, Georgia area, started my business around that same time, or got into the speaking business, I should say, around that same time. So again, been doing that since, 2013 in that business as well, about the same time as airlines and everything else. So that's who I am, where I come from, what I do. But to answer your question, I just said I have a daughter and a son.
Yes.
So my daughter, she is 15. My son is 11. And Saturdays and everything we do is really spent. They're in that age now where they're full up into activities, whether it's dance for my daughter.
Love it.
My son, and right now soccer and basketball, and he's always into something. A lot of times with him was coaching, helping out with that, doing things with them. So it really does revolve around my family and being a dad and obviously a husband as well. So that is the priority. Obviously, that is the most important. And I always say, because everybody's always like, well, how do you have time for, you do all this stuff and things like that. And I do, and it does look busy on the outside. But I heard somebody talk about this the other day, and I don't remember who it was, but they talked about, instead of work-life balance, kind of calling it work-life integration.
I love that.
And so it's like, say you're, in this day and age, like you got for Christmas, for example, so we got 2 weeks off. This is great. I'm going to unplug for 2 weeks. Well, are you really completely unplugging for 2 weeks? Yes, of course you're not. You don't want to be, Christmas Day, doing work, things like that. But it's really, how are you doing little things to get yourself better at whatever you do? And honestly, your professional life, wherever that be, work or whatever, as we all know, that should be something you really enjoy, ideally.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So work-life balance, you kind of get this picture of I'm either working or I'm living my personal life, versus how do we integrate those a little bit? For example, I've taken my son just recently. This is great. My airline job, took him on a trip with me.
That is how we connected. You posted a photo of that on LinkedIn.
In the cockpit. Yes, I remember that.
And I commented and said, I love this. And you reached out to me. That
right.
is how
and
we connected.
I talked about, I don't know if I mentioned in that post, but I think I said something about the work-life integration. And I just thought it was a great example, though. And I've taken, when I go in speaking events, I've taken my wife before, if it worked out. The kids are a little older now, so sometimes it's harder with their school and schedule, but trying to work it in and trying to show them what I do and things like that. So, but you asked about the Saturdays and you wake up, what do you do? That's what it revolves around is what is going on in my family. Now with sports, we're typically doing something on the weekends with their activity, which is just awesome. And then other things I just try to find, I'm big into working out, staying healthy and always doing things like that. I got into jiu-jitsu a couple years ago, so nice. I love that now. I'm a blue belt, but still very, very, I consider myself a beginner. But always trying to stay active and things like that. So I think that's outside of professional stuff, what I, strive to be and strive to do. And my mom lives close to us now. So, helping her with things and being close to her and things like that. So, yep. Okay. Staying involved in the community and, as much as I can, my local outside the OTB, outside the perimeter town.
That's still local.
Right. In Woodstock, Georgia. But being there and be involved in the community, how you can give back and things like that. So,
Okay, so we're going to get back to leadership, but I love the reality that, they say if you want something done, give it to the busiest person that you know.
Yes.
And I can appreciate everything you've said because it looks a lot like my own life with my job at Biolocity, my consulting and keynote speaking and the work that I do, my podcast, and my community work with my church and in my local community.
Right.
And I heard something this weekend. I'm not going to get it accurate, but it was something about what is the difference between a job and joy, right? Something, and I think it is surrounding parts of your life with that joy,
right?
Those joyful moments. And so my question though is going into daily habits. So I've really been focusing on in 2025, trying to go back to my daily routines and starting my mornings with mindful mornings and those healthy habits that I know scientifically. We're both engineers and we're both really into science. So tell us some of your healthy habits that you find give you the energy and the motivation to do all that you do. Right.
Well, I think right now my focus, and just like you said, I'm constantly, I guess, trying to refine that and trying to find the perfect balance and what, what's going to work for me and where I need to get better.
I just have to comment.
I know, right? That's one. That's one. I don't want to say anything, but I think, right now that focus is that the change I'm trying to make is, and I do this a lot anyway, when I am home, obviously with both my main jobs, traveling obviously is almost exclusively on the road. Trying to, when I am home, is be up, in the morning, with the kids before they go to school and whether it's
present.
Drive my daughter to school. She's in that age now where I'm not so cool anymore all the time, or, I'm not always
possible.
But for whatever reason, those drives is when she will, a lot of times we get the conversation started. So even if it's just 10, 15 minutes, I'm taking her to school and back or, or whatever it is, taking her to Starbucks on the way there and doing that. So that's kind of the thing I'm trying to do. And why I say trying to do it is because a lot of times in my schedule, if I finish a trip and I get in late at night, right? Get home late. Well, I do, again, health, kind of a sidebar, but a health standpoint. Several years ago, I read a book and it changed my life on how I viewed sleep. So making sleep a priority. So I am very much big on striving to get that 8 hours. It doesn't always happen, but that's a big deal for me. So if I get in late and the kids are out at school and I may sleep in a little later and not see them. So, but going back to that is when I can enable making that time happen. Outside of that, I am a Christian. And so I do like to start every morning, and I fully honest, I don't always get to do this and I don't always do it, but starting with a devotional and then take some of the time to reflect on that, pray on that. And I don't know what it is, and I can't put my finger on it, but it seems like when I do that most of the time, it's not that the amount of work changes. It just seems that everything just kind of flows a little better, if that makes sense, or just
there's science.
The struggles kind
of
of just, they're still there, but they kind of just, I don't want to say make it easier, but they just kind of flow. You're kind of expecting it, and you're just moving. You're just kind of clicking a little bit and things like that. So that's also been the biggest, thing I've tried to reinforce and focus on. And then my reading, I love reading, but I'm one of these people that's a very slow reader. My wife can sit down and read like a whole book in a day. And I've always, since I was little, just been a slow reader. So also trying to carve out some time in the mornings. And I don't do all these things every morning, but trying to carve out some time, whether it's, read a little bit of a book I've been working on, or, go on to YouTube if there's something I'm trying to learn. Go, even like I talked about jujitsu earlier, go watch some jujitsu videos. Just, it's, take 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes just to try to get myself better at something else before I start digging into, emails or calls or whatever I am doing that day. So, but that's kind of been what I try to do in the mornings is, again, the main focus now is trying to be there when I can for my kids, especially during the school year. The devotions and keeping that up. And then whether it's, reading or something outside of professional life, getting yourself better at something. And to me, that just seems to, because as you know, what do we typically do? We start digging in right away. I got to get this done. I got to do this. And then what happens is you don't give time to yourself. And then before you know it, it's 4:30, everybody's home. Now you're going to, start doing everything else. And so I think that's, it's critical to be very disciplined, in what you do, especially in the mornings, because that's typically, for most people, that's kind of your time. Not everybody, but that's kind of your time to do that stuff and start the day.
Well, it absolutely is. And there's so much research coming out on this. It's the only time of day that you actually own to yourself.
Great point.
And I think it's really important for us to talk about this in a leadership podcast.
Right.
Because as a leader, since it's the only time of the day that you actually own to yourself,
right,
then it is the only time that you can make a conscious decision how you're going to move forward in your day. Okay.
Right.
And so if we move into the habit of snoozing until the very last second, and then jumping out of bed and hurrying up and like going through our emails and responding to things, then we're moving into this mindset of immediately going into problem solving mode and action mode and stress mode. And we start this day full of anxiety, stress, negativity, problems, all of this mindset that then creeps into our family, creeps into our team members, creeps into our business, and it just has this whole cascade effect. And as a negative health effect, negative on our team, negative in every single way. Alternatively, if we capture those moments and we've had a full 8 hours of sleep, the science shows that's what you need for restorative sleep, and we're thoughtful about whatever I am also a Christian, but even if you're not a Christian, whatever, if we do mindfulness, you do a meditation, you take moments and I do a gratitude list every morning. You mindfully practice and think towards something that centers you. Then you start your day in a calmful manner.
100%.
You're looking for the positive. You're looking towards the future. You're looking towards an outlook that can bring positivity, hope, and joy. And you bring that into your family.
Yes.
You bring that into your team and your companies.
And it seems like, I know people think about this, and I mean, you're like, that surely that can't, just because I think about it, but it really does.
It does.
Now, it's not going to be this earth-shattering, thing all of a sudden, but you really will notice that it's like I said about the devotions earlier. There's just something, I can't put my finger on it, but now it doesn't mean I don't have bad days when I do that, but just something that seemed to just flow better. And I think you said it best, with a positive outlook. And you talk about the things of, writing down gratitude. Tony Robbins talks about that a lot, talking about he gets up and starts every day with 3 things he's grateful for that day, whether it's his kid's smile, he woke up that day, whatever it is, he starts his day with 3 things that he writes down and thinks about that he's grateful for. And so I think that is so powerful. And the meditation thing you said is I think that's taking off too. It doesn't have to be prayer, reflection, you can call it meditation, but either way, whatever you're looking at, it's kind of that time to whether it's clearing your mind, really digging deep down. And when we do things, us as humans, and I talk about this in my leadership talking, is what really motivates us. What really gets us going is when you dig down, it's that purpose, that why.
Yes.
And when you do that meditation, when you do that prayer, when you do whatever it is, you're kind of doing that as a mini daily type. What is my real why? So, but every decision you make that day, every priority you do, every task you think about, in the back of that mind there, subconsciously, there's that purpose, that why that you've kind of meditated or thought about or kind of centered before you start that day. So I think that's critically important.
I love that. I have to tell you one thing really quick. When I was in high school, I really wanted to go to the Air Force Academy.
Okay.
And a couple of things is that, one, the only reason I ran cross country in high school is that you really needed to letter in something back in that time. And I went to Griffin High School.
Okay.
And the only thing this white girl that was not athletic could letter in was cross country, because if as long as you ran all the races, even if you finished last, which was me, you got a letter. Okay. So I lettered in cross country. Now, fast forward, what is hysterical is that I subsequently finished 6 Ironmans. I cannot.
That's amazing. That's awesome.
I cannot. I can't run a mile right now. I'm
awesome.
So out of shape. But I've done 6 Ironmans. Okay. So, but then, I get my letter. Okay. But then part of, as you know, the requirements for the PE is you had to be able to do a pull up. I could not do a pull up. So I was like, never mind. I'm just going to get an Air Force ROTC. So I got an Air Force ROTC scholarship.
Oh, nice.
Which I did the first year. And then when you have to sign I convinced them. My other funny thing was that they gave me an Air Force ROTC scholarship. And I completed my test. And they said, oh, you're getting it in electrical engineering. And I said, electrical engineering? I don't want to be an engineer. Engineers are nerds. They wear pocket protectors. They have tape on their glasses, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to be an engineer.
Right.
I'm a biomedical engineer. But
yes.
That was many years later that occurred to me that I should be an engineer. But anyway, so I convinced them to convert my scholarship so I could go to med school. But after the first year, I was like, I'm not sure I want to be a doctor. I dropped my scholarship. Many years later, I went back and got my engineering degree and all these wisdom. But anyway, so I'm envious of you sticking it out, and I guess you could do a chin up. I don't know, but anyway,
I do remember the fitness test that you're talking about.
Yes,
and I remember working on. I mean, I played football in high school. That was kind of my sport, and I remember, I was kind of a bigger kid because I was playing football, and I remember the pull-ups thing. I had to really because I would lift and stuff, but I wasn't doing a lot of that, and I certainly wasn't a runner. And so I remember working on the run and the pull-ups because that was all the fitness tests to get it. Yeah, the sit-up, yeah. So I remember doing that specifically, yes.
I was so annoyed. I could nail the run. I could nail the sit-ups, but a chin-up, I can still picture my 16-year-old self. Like, I can't do it. Okay, we should get back to leadership. Awesome. Okay, so high stakes. Fighter pilot, business leaders. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us about, because you do a lot of talks on this, right? And so talk about the high stakes game of connecting the skills you learned as a fighter pilot and how those align with being a business leader.
Oh man, there's so much. That's quite a fact question there. I don't have time to give you my full keynote here, but no. I think so. I'll just take four main parts, right, of my methodology. Again, earlier I said I call it human factors leadership.
Yep.
Because it's based on not only my time as being an officer, leader, fighter pilot in the Air Force, but also that human factors science. So as I said earlier, I've been a professor for about 14 years, adjunct teaching at several universities, teaching human factors. The reason is because that comes.
So when you say human factors, like, is there a whole list of what human factors entail? I know you said a few examples earlier, but can you give a few examples again?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's not I wouldn't say there's a list per se of human factors, because human factors is really a science. Actually, it's typically associated with human factors engineering, as you probably know about.
Okay.
Which human factors engineering for everybody else is kind of every piece of technology that's designed today, whether it's these chairs we're sitting in, the cars we drive, the airplanes I fly, the laptops, computers, the devices people have, they're using, there is some sort of human factors consideration there. How the human is going to interact with that piece of technology, right?
Got it.
And so what is it typically designed to do? It's designed to mitigate human error, or say, humans, this is where we're typically going to make a mistake. Like when these human factors engineers look at a car, for example.
Okay.
Why do we have the lights in our car that come on that tell you something's wrong? Because they figured out that if we put a light, it's going to draw our attention to that and say, oh, I need to get my oil changed, or something's wrong on my tire. And that's human factors engineering.
And so a more important light is going to flash at this rate, or be this color,
exactly.
or be located
What's going to get the
this
human's
spot.
attention the most?
Exactly.
Right. Just like the modern cars now with the sensors and everything else. So if a car stops in front of you, like my truck does this, it'll go start going. If you're not slowing down, it's going to start, beeping and flashing. It may even start braking for you.
Right.
Again, human factors engineering. What's going to help mitigate human error? So that's where really human factors kind of started, right? That's the idea of it. And so it was big, and it became big in aviation safety probably in the 70s or 80s, which is where I first got exposed to it.
Okay.
Because one thing I did in the Air Force was I went to the Air Force Safety School, which meant that I was qualified, just to be a pilot. I was qualified to, if there was a accident or mishap, I was qualified to go in, investigate it, and we pull out the root causes of what happened and why it happened, and ultimately make recommendations on how we change processes or training to prevent it from happening again.
Right.
But what I learned from that, all that's based on human factors. So what decisions were made in the chain, as we called it, to lead to this accident?
Right.
It may not even be the pilot, the operator. It may be a maintenance error.
Right.
You could even go all the way back to a poor design of something. Because At some point, there are humans in that process that designed this piece of equipment, this airplane, designed the technology. There's a maintainer that worked on it. There's leadership that was responsible for training. There's a operator who was responsible for actuating. So at some point in there was a human error, human decision made.
And I think one of the classic examples of this, and when we tie to like the 5 why methodology and all of that, is the example people might have heard of the Challenger.
Right.
When they dig down to what really caused it was, fear of reporting this issue because of, and really digging into all of those things and not just taking the one thing that seemed most obvious of it.
And that one, I mean, that's a phenomenal example to talk about is that, we won't go into it, but the Challenger that's a classical example of groupthink and poor decision-making with poor risk management based on being influenced by other factors.
Right.
If for everybody doesn't know, the space shuttle program wasn't in a great spot. Congress was pushing them to get something going or they're going to cut their funding. You had the vendors, the contractors that made the solid rocket boosters and all the parts, and they're all together saying, we need a decision basically, and basically pressuring them versus the risk management decision process that that you should be doing of what's the worst that could happen? How are we going to mitigate that? Is this worth it or not type thing. So, but that's a great example of human factors as well, of outside pressures, right? In that particular case, you have all these outside pressures that are pushing you to make a decision. Again, those leaders at NASA, those people involved in that never showed up saying, we want to make a bad decision, obviously, right?
Right.
Tragedy happened. But then you go back to your point, and that's, again, this ties right back into your original question here is, how does this apply to business? Well, again, as leaders, as business leaders, managers, whoever, your people are not showing up every day saying, I'm going to make a bad decision or make a mistake or whatever. There are human factors at play, whether it's their, like I said earlier, fatigue, mental and physical fatigue, right? That's a big one. Complacency, lack of awareness, lack of knowledge of something, lack of communication. All these things are kind of examples of what I call, the human factors that affects us as humans that ultimately drive human error. Now, there is a list that is called the Dirty Dozen, and it's the 12 most common human errors in aviation safety. And this was actually made by the Canadian Air Transport, I think what's called. It's basically their version of the FAA.
Okay.
They developed a list of the 12, and I don't want to, don't put me on the spot, but
I won't.
I know complacency.
The test is coming later.
Complacency and fatigue, for example, are one of the most common human errors because that's what human factors really drives. And you're never going to mitigate all human error, right?
It's
impossible.
We're
humans. Impossible.
Because we're humans, exactly.
But leaders' job is to set up their organization and set up their teams
for redundancy and checkpoints and that
exactly.
Kind of stuff.
Again, going back to the aviation world, right?
Right.
How many checks and balances do we have, from when I show up to that airplane to do the pre-flight check until it takes off?
Exactly. When
we check a certain thing several times, whether it's checklist usage, two-person concept. We talk about monotony, the things we actually have to say, how we double and triple check stuff. So it's all about taking that to business and saying, how do you design your teams and systems,
to set them up for success.
Exactly. And that's what leaders have to do. They got to take that mindset of looking at it not as changing the person, but changing the system. And that's what aviation safety had to learn the hard way in the 70s and 80s. Up until about the 70s and 80s, aviation safety was just kind of like, we'd have an airplane accident. They'd say, well, that's bad, but flying is inherently risky. So we go look, investigate it. Okay, the pilot made an error, bad pilot, don't do that again, And that's kind of how, but then we had some really major accidents, large Boeing 747, jumbo jets that happened. Sadly, a lot of people lost their lives. And we figured out, hey, we got to change the way we do things because we can't have these massive disasters. And that's when we started looking at it of changing the system versus changing the person. Because if you try, like I said earlier, if you try to change the person's don't change
an N of one.
Right.
If you try the system is
everything. Because if you change the person without changing the system, what are you going to get? Same exact results.
Exactly.
Because you're trying to change it for everybody. You're trying to set up a better system. So I was going to give you my 4 points, but we kind of talked about that instead. But I think that's a great connection.
I think I have, let's see, hang on. Let me see if I have in the cards if these are the 4 points. Because then I was like, what is this acronym? Maybe not. So I have this and I was like, what is this acronym? So this could not be your 4 points, but I have this written down. Key leadership traits required to thrive in a volatile uncertain, complex,
Yes.
ambiguous
VUCA,
environment.
VUCA, yes.
I was like, how do you pronounce that? I said, I'm not going to try and pronounce this because I'm going to get it wrong.
Right.
Tell us more about this.
Absolutely. So that's great because, I said earlier that, as a fighter pilot, working in these very dynamic, complex environments, right? And, and now everybody, no matter what industry you're in, what role you're in, most everybody would agree we work in a very complex world. It's only going to get more complex, right? More uncertain.
Yes.
So no matter what you do. So VUCA really defines, that was a term we used. It was.
So I'm going to say it again. It's volatile,
yes,
uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
And that describes the type of environment. So when we trained as fighter pilots, also other special operators use this a lot. So Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, but we use that to define the baseline of the kind of environment we were going to have to operate in, right? So we had to be able to perform at a very high level in a very volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment.
So I'm reading the book right now for a future guest has written, and he's talking in the book about baseball players that they're taught to expect that every pitch is going to be a curveball. Like if you're expecting it, if you're not expecting it, then when it comes, you're not going to hit it.
Right.
But if you're expecting it constantly, then when it comes, you're going to be able to react to it. And I think that's what you're using this example.
I always say a little bit of, I say this in my talk sometimes, but a little bit of healthy paranoia is good, right?
Absolutely.
Because if we're not, what was the opposite of that is complacency.
Exactly.
And that's when things happen. I if I had to pick one human factor that's the most common, I'd say complacency. Because if you think about it, we as humans, what do we like? We like habit. We like doing the same thing. So we kind of almost want to get into a state of complacency. But the problem of complacency is when we're going to miss things. That's when errors going to happen. That's when we're going to forget to do something, or we're going to, not think about this.
Well, you build up muscle memory on purpose, right? Because we have so many inputs.
Because we're good at that.
Exactly.
We're good at habit. Exactly. When we build up that muscle memory. But going back to your point about expecting the worst, that's why we always train at a very high level. We used to say train like you fight, because if your training is way harder than the actual mission you're going to experience, you're already at that higher of a level.
Right.
And so that's 100% correct. But that VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, that was the baseline. And with that, the key word in there is complexity, but really all those words. But what does that really do to us as humans? I just said we don't like complex, right? We like simple. So a VUCA environment.
We don't like ambiguous.
Right. A VUCA environment drives human error, because it's not the type of environments, that we're designed to operate in. I mean, even if you go, I always say this machine up here in our head hasn't changed a whole lot since we were living in caves and, building fires and being chased by saber-toothed tigers, right? It really hasn't. But the problem is our world. I mean, the type of world we is drastically. I mean, flying that, F-15E, can fly 2 times faster than the speed of sound. You can pull up to 9 Gs, or 9 times your body weight when you're maneuvering. There were 250 switches, dials, and displays in that cockpit, right? You could imagine all the bells and whistles and beeps and squeaks that are going, the roar of the engines. That's just the airplane. Now think about operating with a formation of 2 or 3 other jets that you're responsible for, you're leading, and you're going into environments, whether it's weather, whether it's combat. Now you're worried about, the enemy, whether it's terrain, if you're flying down low, and you're trying to organize this mission and keep all these pieces going. Meanwhile, this airplane's throwing all this data at you. I mean, it's just not an environment that the human brain was ever designed to operate in.
And what's important versus what is noise.
And that's what it goes down to, right? That's what it goes down to, which that's the first part of my methodology is clear intent. And I call it, it's clear intent is really a very clear picture of a desired end state, but also with a very narrow focus. Okay. So you're not telling your people.
I like that desired
end state,
what success looks like.
Right.
With a narrow focus.
But with a narrow focus, right? Yeah. Because otherwise, I do this business leaders all the time. I'll sit down with them, before I'm doing a keynote, and I'll say, well, tell me what is your focus for your people? Or what is your, does success look like at the end of this quarter or this year?
Right.
And inevitably they'll start listing all of these things. And I'll say, okay, look, like that's great. And you want to do that stuff, right? You definitely want to do it. I said, a lot of that strategic initiatives, but and I just forced them. I'm like, what are the top 3 or even top two, no more than 3.
If you do nothing else, what are the
that
ones
you want them
to
to keep your people to keep in the back of their mind, right?
Right.
When they're making decisions. Because I don't know of any leader that really doesn't want their people to be autonomous, operate highly, decentralized. But in order to do that with autonomy, what do you have to have? You got to have alignment.
Exactly.
And so when you want your people making those decisions, they got to have a clear intent, a very narrow focus of what's successful. So when they're making decisions and deciding, they're kind of, everybody's going same way, same day. Versus what do we see a lot of in organizations? Everybody's working hard, right? But we're just kind of, the ropes are just all being pulled in different directions. And a lot of times that's because we don't have a very clear intent, a narrow focus.
Yeah.
But that's where that comes down to is that when you're flying in that jet, that's where I got the idea, or one of the ideas of how to explain that. And I'll show them a picture of the cockpit and show them all these different settings and how my instructors or my leadership, my flight leads, and my experience over the years has taught me when you're in certain realms, this is the most important instrument, or these 2 or 3 things are, versus, if you're flying at 30,000 feet, this is what you want to focus on, versus if you're just a few hundred feet off the ground, blitzing around at 500 miles per hour, that's a different set of variables, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. I love going back to what you were saying earlier. One of the things when I'm building and leading companies and teams, I am first off obsessed with checklists. Right. And when I was at one point working towards my private pilots, and when I was proctoring surgeries, and then I would convey to my teams, and I was just like, look, in every surgery, we went through the checklist, in the plane, every time, walk around the plane every single freaking time,
right.
It did not matter. Why did we do that? Because do you know how many times people would forget things like checking their fuel?
Right.
Like super critical things, right?
Right.
And those checklists or those safeguards are there for a reason.
Right.
There's a reason that surgeons still autograph the leg they're going to do surgery on.
Human factors.
Right?
100%.
Once again, human factors. At the AGN group, one of our values is seeing humans as humans. And the reason for that is the other piece of it. When you're talking about people being tired, I think also it's remembering that the people you're working with are humans with families,
exactly,
with perhaps parents who are ailing, or a pet that just passed away,
right,
or someone that is from a different culture that this word means something different to them, or something like that. Those are also human factors in the way that they relate to situations.
Absolutely, because like you said, and that's part of my methodology too, is, as a leader, you've got to understand that people don't just show up to work and check out of everything from home.
Exactly.
Right? Nobody does that. And so, one thing I took from that world I came from as well, in a U.S. Air Force flying squadron, right, is there was that deep level, why we were so successful. I mean, there's a few things, but one of the biggest things, we had this deep level rooted camaraderie, right? And so, and it wasn't forced on us. It was just kind of the way that the culture was. But I think it bled over from, because we knew at the end of the day that one day we're going to be, we are going to be flying together, and we're going to have to count on each other.
Right.
And so that culture, it starts from day one of Air Force pilot training. As a young lieutenant, you're taught that, hey, yes, you all are going to be rank ordered when you graduate. But they used to always say, you don't graduate, your class graduates. Matter of fact,
I love that.
They drove that. It was when I went back to be an instructor, I experienced this as well. As a flight commander, you were essentially responsible for giving probably about 15 to 20 students at any one time, and all the instructors that were responsible. So you're leading 30 to 40 people typically in that role as a young captain. But your grade or your performance, let's say, when you finish pilot training, I would say it was probably majority of it was your daily flying. So how you performed and made decisions, and because every round was graded. Part of it was academics, how you did a little more smaller portion of that. But also there was about a 20% ranking that went into your overall, it was what's called a flight commander ranking. And that was purely a subjective ranking that me and the other instructors would get together, and it had nothing to do with your technical skill set, how you did. This was purely how well of a team player, leader, how well did you provide mutual support to your team? Because we knew how critical it was, and that could drastically change your ranking on
Yes.
how, which is ultimately what you decided, how you got to choose what you're going to go fly, what you're going to do your career, because we knew how important that was. And that's why that grade was in there. But that's what I talk about in my keynotes, is that mutual support. And how do we embed that in organizations? Because really mutual support, we talk a lot about accountability in organizations, which is absolutely critical. But the most powerful form of accountability, and Harvard Business Review has done studies on this, is that peer level accountability. When people, colleagues, teammates hold themselves accountable. I don't even like to say hold themselves accountable. I like to say provided mutual support.
I love
Because you're
that.
backing each other up.
Yeah.
Because I remember, in a fighter squadron, flying in these flying squadrons, I wasn't worried if we were working at a task together, it could be flying or non-flying, just what we called our ground jobs, our admin jobs. If I was working with you in a task, Angela, I didn't want to not do it because I was worried about getting fired or,
You didn't want to let me down.
Exactly. I didn't want to be that person that was the weakest link on your team, because I didn't want to let you down. Because we probably hung out together outside of work. I probably know your family. We do all these events together. So it was a very work hard, play hard kind of mentality group. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that in a business organization, but how do you embed that mutual support? How do leaders really drive that so that their people are holding each other accountable and providing mutual support?
And I love that. Just a couple of other examples that I've seen that. So, for example, I've listened to some of Simon Sinek talks about this on his podcast, and he talks, I believe it's his work that he's done with the Navy SEALs.
He does a lot of work.
Yes. And he's talked about when he goes and observes them, and he's like, I'm confused. I'm watching this exercise that you guys are doing, and you're grading them, but you're not watching to see if they complete the task. And they're like, well, that's not what we care about. We're watching to see their leadership, because that's what matters. Their teamwork, that's what matters, right? And then I think there was another example. I believe it was the movie Maverick. Was that the follow-up to Top Gun?
Yeah, Top Gun
and they
Maverick,
were out
yes.
playing volleyball on the and the guy comes up and he's like, I thought you were gonna make leader, whatever. I'm horrible at quoting these things. But the point was, he was like, you wanted a team, or you want
Here you
whatever.
Go, there's your team.
Here's your team. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think of a personal example is when I was at school at Georgia Tech, I had a classmate, Chris Herman. And he and I and another one, Mario Ball, the three of us, like whenever we could be on a team together for a group project, we are stuck like glue.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward years later, Chris was starting his startup at ATDC down the hall from me starting my startup. Both of our startups were phenomenally successful.
Right.
Chris is now running Capstone at Georgia Tech. I'm now running Biolocity at Georgia Tech and Emory. He was the chair, like I got him on the chair of, like, we are lifelong friends. We were both phenomenal leaders. We identified that in each other back then.
Yeah.
And I think great leaders also identify that in each other and want to collaborate. So I think when you start seeing that in people that attract each other, it's also something in your teams.
Right.
If you start seeing in a team, a dysfunctional team, then start asking questions like, what is happening here?
Absolutely.
Because that is something to look at. Okay, I want to know I love the idea of debrief culture.
Yes.
Because I think that too few teams and organizations do this. I think, especially in the startup world, and I shouldn't even say that. I think it's in all cultures. We have this idea, we should just hurry on to the next project and that's done. We know what we've learned on it and we haven't, right? So tell me your philosophy on the debrief culture.
Absolutely. I knew this was going to come up, and I'm so glad it did, because I think people often ask, what's the biggest tool or best tool you think leaders can take away? And I think if you're talking about a specific tool, I think this is it. Now, it's based on, a little bit other stuff we're talking about, accountability, transparency within an organization, which, by the way, the reason you and your teammates, y'all work together so well, I would bet, is because there was a lot of transparency when y'all worked together in your teams, and you hold each other accountable, and each of you saw that. So I would venture to say that's probably what happened, but it's the debrief, and a true debrief culture is based on a lot of that. But with the debrief, the fighter pilot debrief specifically, there's a lot of ideas. You talked about the 5 whys earlier. You talk about root cause analysis.
Yep.
what are after action reports, postmortems,
Yep,
which I absolutely hate. That term.
I hate that.
Because
that needs to
that's
be
a good
out of
point.
the
But
way.
why do we hate that term? Because you're implying that it was a
like
bad.
It's dead.
Right.
Actually, postmortem, I feel like you're
Exactly.
in the morgue in
just
a
the
hospital.
connotation, right?
Yes.
It's just not like it was a bad event or bad project. So we're
Exactly.
gonna debrief this.
Let's just remove that
But
word.
debriefs should really be done, after every event task,
Including
not
successes.
I think I would argue sometimes even more importantly for successes, because you want to know why it was a success, right? So you can repeat that. So, but the debrief, I think there's organizations that say, yeah, we debrief. I think a lot of times,
I would say, tell me more. How do you do that?
Right. Because they're probably sitting down, they're probably talking about, hey, let's talk about what would happen. Okay, yeah, okay, we're gonna do this better. Okay, great. But a true debrief, there's a few parts of it. But the first part is, if you don't get the first part right, you can forget about it being a valid debrief. And that part is,
okay, I'm holding my breath
setting
now
that tone, setting that tone of accountability, right?
Okay.
A tone of accountability. And so you can find this by saying you want respectful truth versus that artificial harmony. Respectful truth versus artificial harmony. Because where do we typically live in as humans?
Artificial
We
harmony.
try to get along, right? We
Yeah.
avoid conflict for the most part.
Yeah.
Artificial, great for social settings, cocktail parties, things like that, just jibber jabber, but not good if you're trying to really improve the team, right?
Yeah.
So the first part of that, what sets, I think, the fighter pilot debrief, the biggest piece of it is setting that level of that tone of accountability. Okay. And there's ways to do that and ways that leaders do that, but you got to get that right first. But the other part of the debrief is realizing that it's not about, individual execution necessarily. It's not about saying, hey, Angela, let's talk about your performance here. That's not what it's about. It's about team performance.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, the sole purpose of that debrief, all it's there for is to what? Drive better performance. That's it. Period. Dot. More specifically, to develop lessons learned to drive better performance.
But let's go back. How can you tell the difference between the genuine versus the disingenuine harmony? You said it better. Your two different phrases. Well, how can you really tell the difference?
Well, think about it. When if you said, you probably didn't experience this, right, in your professional life. If you sat down with a small team, you said, okay, let's talk about this. You just sat and you're like, hey, how can I do better for y'all? And what typically happens? Hey, you're great. No, come on, guys, really, or it's like, what do y'all think? What can we do better here? Maybe a couple of people will say something, but but it was a really hard task. So we're not really going anywhere. Not really, because
you're like, you guys are all full of shit.
And so, because you got to bring those barriers down, right?
Right.
And so one of the, I think, not easiest, but one of the most logical ways that I found that I pass on to business leaders, I talk about this in my keynotes, I do it in my debrief workshops that I do with teams, is the leader of that particular project, which, by the way, in this debrief, who should be in this debrief? Only the people that were executing on this task. It doesn't have to be the leader of the organization. Because if, say, you own a small tech company or whatever it is you own, if you weren't really involved, you knew about it, but if you weren't really on the team executing, you really shouldn't be in there. You should let them debrief. Now, they should bring back to you, hey, here's some things we learned.
Results, right.
But this
is powerful, because
it's not,
you being there, you actually take away from them being able to actually openly
because now
debrief.
here you are sitting in the corner room listening you want them to really improve.
Be honest.
So it only should be, now if you were part of that task, absolutely should be in there.
Right.
But who should be running that debrief is whoever that team leader was, or whoever was responsible for that project, that task.
Yeah, that's a really important piece of it.
So that's part of the accountability, getting that out. But also, I always say, leaders, before you start this debrief, always open it up with, here's some things I could have done better for you as a team. And that's the first thing you do. And really lay out something. And it doesn't have to be earth-shattering stuff. Even if you think it went great, pull something out. You got to open up something. Then you have to go around the room and you've got to make everybody give you one thing that you could have done better. Not the team, but you as a leader. How could you have set them up better, or something they saw that you did? And all you're doing, the whole purpose of that is just to bring down those barriers of communication. Now we can kind of start talking, because think about it. If you have a very junior team member in there,
right,
and they see a person with more experience,
exactly,
and opening up, and then they're like, well, hey, if, Angela she's been here this long, she's this expert and this and that. If she can open up things, surely I can admit where I had some shortcomings, maybe, as we talk about.
Right. It is safe. It's a safe environment.
Safe environment. We used to call it in the fighter part, was a sacred environment. When that door's shut, and remember in the military, we were still we had, we carry rank on our shoulders. It's a very
Right.
hierarchical, rank structure. But when we shut that door to the debrief, it was almost symbolic that all the rank comes off. We're all there purely and I've been in debriefs with, colonels or generals. So people that outrank me by years, and they essentially, some of them, could own my career.
Right.
But we were in that room, but not only did they expect, or not only did they welcome, but they expected me and the others to talk about execution and some of their missteps, because they knew that was the only way that team was going to get better. That was the only way that people's lives may be saved one day.
Amazing.
And so, but again, it does go back also, though, you got to have a culture of that mutual support, which I talked about earlier, which is so, because you can't just have a,
it's a waste
a leader
of time.
that's not transparent, a leader that's not accountable himself, then you go in a room and expect them to open up, right? It's just not going to happen.
Right. That's really a manager,
as
not a leader.
What's that?
That's really a manager.
Right. You're managing resources, right? You're not leading people.
Exactly.
Exactly. But I think that's the biggest piece.
Those people don't listen to this podcast. So we're not
right. It's not the manager podcast.
Exactly. It's not the shitty manager podcast.
Well, and here's another good point is, people listening, they're like, well, I'm not really in a leadership, which, by the way, I hate the term leadership role, because leadership is not a role. It's not a title. It's a mindset, right?
Exactly.
It's something you do and you grow in. And so I always say everyone is a leader in some aspect.
Yep.
Typically, if you really think that. And I think actually those informal leaders, people that aren't in a specific title or position, I think informal leaders in an organization many times are even more powerful than the actual, leader
Absolutely.
on title or on paper, because they typically have the sway of the. And why is that? Because they drive that mutual support. Yeah. That's the one that people go to for mentoring, for advice, things like that. So everybody's a leader in some sense.
If nothing else, then the fact that we're all leaders of ourselves and we only have one life to live.
Right.
We only have one legacy. And so I think that's a really important leadership to
Absolutely.
have.
Absolutely.
So debrief culture, one of the things that I was thinking about as the debrief culture that to me, I think it's really sad when we skip that step is that there are so many times that it's also the opportunity to document some of those things, to then put it into play and put it into this repeatable, scalable format that can create something that's plug and play for the next team to create new checklists or new formulas or new things like that just make it so much easier for the next obstacle challenge.
That's at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Because I talk about this too. One thing that makes the debrief different from what I talk about than anything else is if you don't have a specific way to capture those lessons learned, I should say, or those organizational practices, behaviors, processes we're going to change. If you don't assign accountability to that at the end of the, okay, how are we going to implement this or take this to the boss or this or that, then kind of what's the purpose of doing it sometimes? Now I will say there's something to be said for, and by the way, the reason I say debrief culture, because it's just that. It's a way of doing business. It's not just we're going to debrief after every quarter or every year. I would do this with sales teams all the time. I said, hey, look, you don't have to go in a room, shut the door and go in there for an hour with a large team and debrief. You can debrief a sales call, just for 15, 20 minutes with maybe a teammate that was on a call. Hey, let's talk about this real quick. Kind of go through the, how you set the tone of accountability. You can go through it that way and pull out some lessons learned. So you don't have to necessarily write everything down. But to your point, when you are debriefing a large task, right, you've got to have a way to transfer those lessons learned, embed them in the organization. Otherwise, what's the point, of driving all these, you talk about all this stuff, what can be better, but if you don't have anything to take back to the organization, because really the goal of it is what? That everybody else in that team does better. Everyone
grows.
Benefits. Growth versus blame. Growth culture versus blame culture, right?
Exactly.
That's what you're trying to do. Because typically we've been in a, in some organizations still like this, that blame and train approach. Kind of like I was talking about aviation safety. Up until the 70s, 80s, was always like, bad pilot doing that again. Well, Angela, you messed up. Hey, don't do that again. Do we need to train you up again? Again, Angela didn't show up saying, hey, I'm going to make a mistake today, right?
My whole goal today
there
is
is
to be
something in the
dumbass.
system, right? There's some, there is, I'm not here to sabotage this, right? There's something in the system, whether it's, maybe you do have some fatigue. Maybe you got stuff going on at home. Maybe you weren't given a piece of information that you were supposed to be given. Maybe you were thrown at the last second. Your awareness of the client wasn't that great. You just don't know. So until you really dig down and debrief this and find those holes in the system, that's how you have to really approach that.
Yeah,
that growth
absolutely.
mindset.
And if your team members hear the word debrief and they get a knot in their stomach, that is a very big red flag. That means your culture is not a healthy culture for that sacred, safe environment. I love that image of closing the door and the stripes coming off. Like, that was such a powerful image for me. I think that's such a healthy environment of thinking of something that's a safe.
It's a no name, no rank environment, right?
Exactly.
And
I love that.
that's why people say, I use that example because they're like, well, the team I work in, we don't really have a lot of no name, no rank. I don't really see this working here. And I say, hey, look, if you can work in the military where, we clearly have a very rigid rank structure,
Exactly.
It can work anywhere.
It can work anywhere.
It can work anywhere. Yeah.
Okay. My last question before we try and wrap this up, because we could talk forever, is tell me about your philosophy of a just culture.
So a just culture, very similar to that debrief culture, right? Mm-hmm. The term just culture, it actually comes from the aviation safety world. And it's kind of similar to that tone of accountability, but it's that non-retributional, non-punitive kind of mentality, right? And so it's really, when I said earlier, a growth culture versus a blame and train culture, that's really what it's all about.
Okay.
And this came about, again, when aviation safety, when we said, hey, we got to start changing things in the 70s and 80s in commercial aviation, up until, I'd say probably 20, 30 years ago, and not my industry that I'm in now, if you made a mistake, flying, whether nothing happened, but you made a mistake, and somebody knew about it, you were seriously worried about job action or something happening.
So you were very likely to try and cover anything up.
Well, I don't say people try to cover things up, but it was definitely a more, I'd say, fearful environment of making a mistake, right?
Got it, yeah.
Because, and definitely not an environment of where you want to pass it on and tell somebody, hey, I made this, maybe we should look at a better way of doing this. Definitely not. But the aviation safety world figured out, hey, look, if we don't have this just culture, this idea that as long as it's not, willfully violating rules and things like that good safety programs have this idea that you can fess up and say, hey, look, we made this mistake today. Here's the reasons why. Highly recommend it. And so now in the aviation safety world, commercial aviation, we have this program called the ASAP program, Aviation Safety Action Program. And professional pilots or even non-professional pilots can submit forms, and we do it all the time of little errors we see and things we see. And that's one of the reasons, sadly, we had an accident, just about a little over a week ago.
Right.
But prior to that in the U.S., the last major accident in the U.S. with fatalities was 2009. Wow. That's a phenomenal, when you think about the thousands
and because
and
I know this
thousands,
podcast is going to be really successful and people 10 years from now are going to be listening. We're recording this in 2025.
Right,
so, can we do the math? What was that, like 14 years? Am I going to get the math wrong? That was a long time ago.
When you think about the thousands and thousands of flights per day, that's a phenomenal safety record. But of course, there's a lot that goes into that, better technology, all this kind of stuff, and better training. But really, a lot of it too is because of this just culture we had, where professionals can admit where they saw things happen, but we were open to admit it. Why? Because we knew that if I admit this, I'm not going to get any action taken on me. But that's the kind of that just culture. It's really psychological safety. That it's same thing as that, but I always say just culture was around before psychological safety was cool, right? Before psychological safety was really a buzz term. I think we had this just culture mindset in aviation safety. Because the idea of aviation safety is just that, right? We want to make everything safe. We want to make it better. And so just culture is the idea that anyone can speak up, anyone can say, going back to healthcare, right? You talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
A lot of my clients, one of the reasons I do a lot of healthcare groups, hospitals, things like that, is because guess where they've gotten all those checks and balances you talk about came from the aviation world, specifically the aviation safety world.
Yeah.
And so very similar to, the commercial airline industry in the 70s and 80s, the captain of that airliner, they were king. You didn't correct them. You didn't stop in and say something. Versus when we learned all these accidents were happening because other crew members weren't speaking up, we had to make a change, a mindset shift. And that's, again, about just culture, that anyone can speak up. Same way with doctors, the OR.
Yep.
You don't correct the doctor. And then we figured out, hey, wait, they are human.
Yes.
Things happen.
Yes.
So anyone should be able to speak up. Anyone should be able to call a timeout or as they call it, or anyone needs to say when they see something going wrong or a better way to do something.
Yes.
But that's also about a just culture. People can speak up in a very non-retributional, non-punitive environment. But that's also the kind of environment you have to even have that debrief culture, that debrief where people, and that's, again, you talked about earlier, people get that knot in their stomach when they hear the word debrief in a team. Well, I'd venture to say they're probably not doing debriefs very much, which is another way to really make those debriefs go better is consistency, doing it more and more. It's like anything else, right? If you just debrief twice a year, it's probably not going to go well when you do that, right? But if you debrief after every task, a way you do business and have that just culture, then those debriefs are probably going to go better because it's something you practice, something you do and see it.
Well, and I'm thinking a couple of things. One, it's 16 years. I didn't have a calculator. So
I wasn't going to try to do mental math in public here.
Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh, can I say an engineer and I can't do mental math? Anyways, the other thing I was going to say is, so I have this life experience that I share with a lot of people that I had. And so this was circa 2000 and maybe 2008. Mm-hmm. And I was a proctor. I worked for Medtronic, and I was a proctor for a surgery at a hospital in Atlanta. And I observed an instance where a particular lead, I didn't feel like it was appropriately placed by the fellow. And I was too shy to speak up. And I had this like pit in my stomach. You know, I'm a young graduate engineer. Right. And I was just like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm too shy. Here's this like, you know, doctor and all that. And so I was like, maybe it'll be okay. Right. In my head. And I'm not going to speak up. And so I test the patient afterwards. I was like, maybe it's okay. And I'm driving home and I'm paranoid about this. And so I'm so paranoid. I turn around and I come back to the hospital. Sure enough, the lead is dislodged. And so I call the head of this trial at the hospital and I tell him, which was, first off, the best move I made in my career because I owned up and said I should have spoken up. I didn't say anything. I told him. Had this whole cascade effect because the head doctor should have been in the room and he wasn't. So then he got in trouble. So then he yelled at me because it was this whole cascade effect. And it took years for me to get my credibility back to this doctor who should have been in the room the whole time. Right. But the lessons that I eventually got my credibility and got my thing back, and and I have all my credibility in space. But the lesson that I tell people about is a couple of things. One is trust your gut and speak up. You can do it in a very professional. So I learned after that instance, and how I got my credibility back is I learned how to speak up with confidence and respect, and how to coach and guide these electrophysiologists in front of their staff. Right. Without making it seem like I thought they were stupid or something like that. Like I saw other people do. Get that, right? Yeah. I learned this skill that was so valuable for all of my career. Right. So I learned how to do that. I learned how to, once again, trust my gut. I learned that when I called and admitted this huge mistake, I didn't die. Right. What's the worst that could happen type thing? Right. I also learned that what type of environment I wanted to work in. And so a lesson I would want the listeners to learn from this is that if you're in a culture and you try several times to speak up, you try and do debriefs, you try and do this, and you repeatedly get shut down, then maybe that's not the environment you need to be in. 100%. 100%. And the other part of that, because I kind of going back to when I said people say, well, we don't have a very debrief culture or just culture where I work at. And I say, I get that. And you're probably right. I said, but in the example you said, I said, influence where you can, though. You know, even if it's only just one coworker and you can do mini debriefs, or you can do, show accountability with them, influence where you can. And then, but going back to your point, if it's coming down to whether it's toxic leadership or leadership that's just not transparent, or in your case, not accountable, then because nothing's more demoralizing, right? Again, in this example, using that doctor as a leader, right? Nothing's more demoralizing than a leader that blames their people for something they did, right? Right. So, second to that is a leader that can admit their own shortcomings or their own, missteps and things like that. And so, but yeah, if you're in that type of environment, it might be, hey, this is not a fit for you or type thing. Because you're right. If you're never going to change people, like I said earlier, you're only going to change a system. And so you got to have influence to change that system. But if you can't and you want to be there,
then I always say influence where you can. Influence with who you can, whether it's just a coworker, peer, or somebody else.
And start with yourself, which I think
Absolutely.
was my biggest key, because what I did was I was like, you know what? I'm going to learn how I can better influence those around me in a healthy way. And that was the greatest thing that I took away from that.
So you debrief yourself, right?
I debrief myself.
Which is actually a very valuable tool too.
Exactly.
Do not erase that. There is power in self-debriefs, I call it, for sure.
It was the greatest mistake I made in my professional career, and it helped me skyrocket through my career.
That's awesome.
Brandon, is there anything you really hoped we would cover that we haven't covered?
This just came to me as you were talking about that, and I don't know why, but a question I get sometimes, people say, do you think leaders are born or are they made, or what, the age-old debate? And I always say, I fully do not believe leaders are born. I think we're born with God-given strengths, talents, skill sets, some of those skill sets that do translate well to being a good leader, but none of us are born with every single trait, characteristic, ability to be a good leader.
1000% agree.
And I bring that up because it's so important, I think, especially what we'll see in highly technical roles, or I see this in sales. Again, bringing up sales because I see this all the time, is you'll have a salesperson come in, they do really well, they hit their quotas or blow them out of the water, and hey, you did a good job, Angela. We're going to give you a small team to lead, they say, right? And keep in mind, you probably had almost zero leadership training or zero leadership experience, right? And if they give you 2 or 3 people, you may do pretty well because they're just trying to keep up with you. But then where we typically see people stumble is when they take on that larger leadership role, whether it's a bigger team now or like a regional sales manager or whatever, and they stumble there. Why? Because yes, they're very good at their technical job, but they've been taught and experienced and are given no leadership, training, no leadership mentoring or anything like that. Now, some people may be able to do okay because they're a really good communicator, but they don't really empower people well, or they don't really know how to drive accountability, or they don't know how to inspire, or they don't know how to, what motivates my people. There's just so many things that goes into that. And so I love to say that because I think leadership is something that has to be, it's like anything else. It's got to be developed. It's got to be practiced. I mean, as a leadership speaker, I'm still looking at how do you do this better, and I think about, I think I took for granted in the Air Force as a very young officer how much responsibility and, leadership authority and training we were given and expected to pass on. And I think I just took it for granted because when I got out, started running these businesses, I'm like, man, like there is just, you can do a lot of good things here. You got a lot of smart people, but some of these leaders in very, very high, roles in the organizations, I could tell didn't really know the first thing about true leadership. I think a lot of it. And so I just think that's so important for people to understand that, leaders are not born, they're developed, they're made. So just because you're good at a certain skill set or your job, doesn't mean you're going to be a great leader per se.
No, I love that. And much to what you were saying, like every day I'm obsessed with certain podcasts. I'm obsessed with books. I'm obsessed with learning.
Right.
Another one of the AGN group values is we're lifelong learners. And I'm constantly picking up little tidbits. I've picked up things from you today that I cannot wait to test out. And I think that's also the sign of a good leader is they constantly want to grow and become better at that.
Right.
Okay, so a requirement of the podcast is your favorite motivational
favorite quote
or
quotes.
Yes. Depending on what you're going to slip in.
Yeah, there's a few that have come to mind. I think I'll pass this one on because it's not just leadership. I think it's motivational. And when you first hear it, you're probably going to think, really? But it's from Nick Saban is the one who's I've heard say this. And I'm not an Alabama fan, but I thought it was a phenomenal, idea. And he said, don't be average.
Oh, I love. Okay.
Very simple, very to the point, right? And you first hear like, well, don't be average. Well, people say, well, you can't be perfect. And I'm like, yeah, that's not what it's saying. And if you listen to and talk about it more, you really think about it. And I've got it to where I tell my kids this now when they're working on something and they're like, even if it's just simple stuff around the house, like say they, finish a snack and they just leave their trash. I was like, hey, don't be average. Like, don't leave this here. Like go, that's the easy thing to do. Get up and walk away. It's very simple to not be average and just throw your stuff away. Right. But it goes back to when they're doing schoolwork or when they're doing any task or whether in their activities and things like that. I never expect them to be the best, kid in that on the field, the best student, anything like that. I'd love for that, but I don't expect that. But what I do expect is not to be average. Like, you're putting in that extra effort. When you're doing your math homework, you're not just sloppily writing it down. Let's be neat about it, right? But I think that's important because, Nick Saban, he talked about this, and I think he was talking to a group of coaches or something, this event he was doing. And he said, look, when you get a kid that comes out for football and, he's okay, he's good, but he's just not going to that next level. He's not giving the extra effort. He's like, look, don't think there's something wrong with him. That's normal. It's normal for us as humans to be average, just to get by. Like I said earlier, we just want habit, want simple, right? Yeah. And so as a leader, when you say don't be average, you're really trying to, that's the beauty of leadership is, right? How do you motivate, inspire, drive people to be better than average, to really want them to be better and to not be average. And so I think that idea, it's just so simple. I think don't be average it's not about being perfect, but it's, average is easy, right? Average is just getting by. So how do we drive our people? How do we set up organizations? How do we consider human factors, as we've talked about, to not be average, to drive those better results? Because at the end of the day, what is a leader's ultimate job? When it comes down to it, a leader's job is to drive better performance, period, dot, for that team, for the organization, for the people. Now, we can talk all day about how you do that, but that's the ultimate job of that leader. And so that's why I like that quote. I think it's just so, I was thinking of a few, but I think that one kind of is just very simple and an easy takeaway, I think.
Perfect. Katie's going to love that little snippet.
Nice.
I will tell you of so many reasons I love this. One is that when my daughter was young, I thought of several quotes I wanted her to memorize so that, when I'm dead one day, she'll say, as my mom used to always say, and one of them is anything worth doing is worth doing well.
Yep.
And then the other thing, my official hashtag for 14 years now is be brave, be badass. And the reason for that is I strongly believe every individual, team, company, organization has their own badass. Right. And that is the absolute best they can be on that day or in their lives, right? And I believe that a lot of people just aren't brave enough to reach that badass. And if we're brave enough to reach that badass, then we're going to leave our personal legacy. We're going to leave a statement we're absolutely not going to be average.
We're often our own worst enemy, right? We stop ourselves typically. So that's 100% love that.
So thanks for bringing the badass to this podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode of the Badass Leaders Podcast. To hear more interviews with industry experts and learn how to grow your career and leadership potential, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to ensure you do not miss future episodes. This podcast is a production of the AGN Group in collaboration with Bedhead Media. To learn more about the AGN Group, visit our website at theagnGroup.com. There, you can discover more about our services, which include hosting workshops, management consulting, brand strategy, keynote speaking, and more. Follow us on all social media channels shown on the screen and displayed in the show notes. And until next week, be brave and be badass.